Introduction into the budget. The federal government's budget process is complicated. It involves the president and Congress and the political parties standoff. It is fiscal policy. What is fiscal policy? It's the government's policy regarding taxes and spending. It is policy that addresses the question, do we stimulate or encourage the economy to grow, or do we allow businesses to be the drivers of our economy? Questions are asked like, what do you do to the amount that people pay in taxes? Should government spend more or less? And of course, the Republicans and Democrats have two different views on what we should do. Revenues. This is the money that the government receives. Through taxes, yes, but the government also receives money through fees, like user fees like for passports, and fines, customs, and duties. Expenditures. This is the money that the government spends on providing numerous services that we depend on. Balancing the budget. Balancing the budget means that your revenues are equal to your expenditures. This is difficult to do because Americans expect a lot of government services, but we hate paying taxes. We want our roads to be nice, we want our schools to be great, but we don't want to have to pay for them. And we've hated paying taxes since the 1960s. This correlates with our mistrust of government. We don't like tax increases because we don't trust the government to spend our money well. A budget deficit occurs from increased spending when the government is spending more money that it brings in on it every year. When we had the recession in 2007, 2008, 2009, what we were doing as a government is we were increasing the spending of our government to provide services like unemployment insurance. That's just one example, and also stimulus to try to get people working again. The only problem is because people were struggling financially, we couldn't ask them to pay for this spending. So budget deficit occurs from increased spending and tax cuts when the government is spending more than they make. Okay, if you spend more than you make, how do you have to pay for things? You have to borrow money. And our national debt is the money that we borrow every year to cover our budget deficits. So that would be like paying your mortgage or paying for your bills with a credit card. At the end of the year, you're in debt. So don't get those two confused. The deficit is how much we spend over what we make in a year. The national debt is the accumulation of money that we've borrowed in order to cover that deficit. You will hear pay as you go or PAYGO. PAYGO policy requires Congress to pay for its spending. Generally, if Congress wants to spend money on something, PAYGO requires them to cut elsewhere in the budget, or they have to raise taxes. So if Congress wanted to spend an extra $80 billion on education, then Congress has to cut $80 billion from somewhere else, or raise $80 billion in taxes. Omnibus versus stopgap. What we would like to see in this country would be an omnibus package or budget package. This means that Congress and the President have passed a budget that will cover spending for a whole entire year for all of our government programs, and also have passed tax rates for the whole entire year. We don't do that. Instead, we go stopgap. We pass our budget, and instead of at a year at a time, we do it in increments of a month or 2 months or 3 months at a time. Okay, sources of revenue. Okay, what is the largest source of revenue according to this chart? It is individual revenue from income taxes. Income taxes, or the taxes that you pay out of your paycheck, is the largest percentage of the federal government's revenue. It is the percentage of a person's earning that goes directly to the government. And it was established in 1913 with the passage of the 16th Amendment. And now the Congress has the authorization to collect income taxes, and that income tax rate is initiated by the House of Representatives. And the IRS collects those taxes. The IRS audits your taxes, which means they double check them and make sure that you're paying the right rates and that you're not cheating them. And they prosecute people who don't pay their taxes. Social Security taxes. Social Security tax is paid by your business or your employer and yourself. It's the money that's collected from workers to pay for the current benefits that are collected from Social Security. So, Social Security taxes are taken out of my paycheck to pay for my grandparents' Social Security check. Both of these, income tax and Social Security, are progressive taxes. Progressive taxes means the more money you make, the more money the government takes. People with higher incomes pay a greater percentage of taxes. Which political party agrees with this? Well, the Democrats would agree with it. Opponents of a progressive tax believe that we should implement a flat tax or just have a sales tax where everybody pays 10% of their paycheck in taxes or 5% of their paycheck in taxes. And then for luxury items like a Coach bag or a yacht, then you pay a higher sales tax on that because you don't have to buy those products. But income tax, everybody has to pay it. We have no control over it. When you make more money, say you make more money one year than the next, you're going to pay a higher income tax rate. The federal government borrows money. They borrow money from foreign investors, from foreign governments, and they borrow money from the people by selling U.S. savings bonds, and then they pay you back with interest. Borrowing is deficit spending. It is when you are spending money you do not have. It is necessary for the national government to pay for services, and sometimes it's necessary for them to stimulate the economy during during economic downturns. We didn't have money in the United States to pay for the Troubled Asset Relief Program or the big bank bailouts, but it was necessary to spend that money in order to save the United States from a depression. So we turned to China, and China let us borrow some money. The money the government owes is the debt, and they have to pay back the interest, which consumes about 10% of our federal budget. Future generations are going to have to pay this back. Okay, it's not a huge deal. I don't want y'all to get too freaked out that we're about $7 trillion in debt. What you want to avoid is that your debt stays close to what your country can make as far as a GDP. A GDP is the gross domestic product of your country. And if the United States can, in a given year, make or produce services that make us near $17 trillion a year, and it kind of matches our debt, then we'll be okay. Also, China is never going to ask for all their money back. They would cripple our economy, and they need us. They need our economy. They need us to buy socks and t-shirts and gadgets. Tax loopholes. These actually can make it harder for the government to make money. Tax loopholes are tax breaks or benefits, such as exemptions or deductions. Like, you can deduct from your income the amount of money that you pay on interest on your mortgage, or the amount of interest that you pay on your student loan. Or when you have a kid, you can deduct money from your income for the fact that you have a kid. Now, tax loopholes or ways to get around paying your taxes or paying such a high rate of taxes can again cost the federal government money. There's a lot of reasons the federal government gives tax loopholes. Okay, that relates to tax expenditures. Tax expenditures are revenue losses that result from special exemptions, exclusions, or deductions. These are called tax credits or tax incentives. It's like a coupon the government gives the people to kind of get them to do something. A tax expenditure would be like giving me a tax break for buying a high energy appliance. So at the end of the year, when I file my taxes, I can kind of cash in that government coupon and they'll take the cost of my fridge off of my taxes that I have to pay. It's a real simplistic way to look at it, but essentially that's how it works. So the government's trying to make me be more energy efficient by giving me a coupon, but in the long run, that prevents them, the government, from collecting a higher rate in taxes. You'll hear a lot about tax reform. We haven't reformed our tax system since 1986 when Ronald Reagan and Democrats in Congress pushed for the Tax Reform Act. It was an overall reduction of how much everybody paid in taxes, from the poor to the very rich. It eliminated taxes for the very poor, but it reduced the number of exemptions and deductions you could take. And rich people were okay with the reduction in exemptions and deductions because they were paying a lower tax rate anyway. So if you reduce their rate to 20% instead of 40% that they had to pay on their income, they were okay for not having to come up with deductions or exemptions to lower their tax rate. The government just made it simple for them. Expenditures. There are two types of spending. There's mandatory spending and there's discretionary spending. So mandatory or non-discretionary spending is spending that must be included in the budget. You can't cut mandatory spending in order to balance the budget. We have to spend it. We don't have a choice. Discretionary spending. This is spending that the government or policymakers can use their judgment on when appropriating money for these services or projects. It can be increased if there's extra money, or it could be cut, which is more likely, if we don't have money to cover it. Your mandatory examples of mandatory spending would be the interest on debt, money that we have to pay out in Social Security, money that we pay out in Medicare, and then examples of discretionary spending would be transportation and education, research, things like that. National security is an interesting thing. It's technically a discretionary expenditure, which means you can cut national security. And we're currently doing that. With the major sequestration or budget cuts that were implemented last year, you see huge cuts in military spending. Right now, our Congress members, Randy Forbes, Bobby Scott, and our senators, Mark Warner and Tim Kaine, are pushing hard to prevent major military cuts because it would have a huge impact on our economy. But they want to cut the number of people serving in the military in order to save money. They also want to cut military benefits or pension benefits for people who are under the age of 65 in the military. National security is hard to cut because it can be political suicide. It makes you look as a Congress member like you're attacking our people who've served in the military. It's much easier to cut social services. It's much easier to cut discretionary social services like education, welfare, food stamps, things like that. But a large part of social services is the Social Security payouts. Social Security is a mandatory expenditure and it will continue to be raised and go up because the number of senior citizens is growing because of the baby boom population. Also, senior citizens are highly organized and they will push for the preservation of their benefits. Entitlement programs. Entitlement programs are anything that the government has promised as a payment to people. If you are entitled to get this payment if you are eligible according to federal rules. So you can get an entitlement if you qualify for the service, like welfare. You get welfare if you qualify by living below the poverty line. Social Security, again, is an entitlement program. You get Social Security if you're over 65. Medicare is an entitlement program. You get it, and qualifying means that you're old. Okay? So entitlements are also a huge federal government expenditure. Okay, uncontrollable expenditures, these are things that you cannot stop the payments to. Again, mandatory spending like entitlements like Social Security, also paying the national debt or the interest on the national debt is an uncontrollable expenditure. You can't cut it. Incrementalism. Incrementalism is a tool that's used by the president and the OMB when they come up with a budget. It's a good indication of how much money to ask for from Congress. So what the president and the OMB does is they ask for what they at least needed this year plus an incremental increase. So if they needed $80 billion for education this year, next year, because of incrementalism, they're going to ask for $82 billion. Sometimes, and very rarely, the president will ask for flat funding. Flat funding is the opposite of incrementalism, where you're asking the exact same amount or asking for the exact same amount of money you needed from last year. All right, here is an overview of the budget process. We'll start that in a minute.